We have with us today Ms. Elsa from Migration Country Office from Belgium. Ms. Elsa is going to give an overview of the Ecocity Project, which also the LCA was part of this project. We did participate in this project, which eventually it resulted into a formulation of a toolkit. But obviously, Elsa will provide more details to you, local councils and also local councils employees, which this project could be beneficial in our daily administration of our offices. Thank you. The floor is yours, Elsa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will just share then my screen. Just give me 1 second and it will be easier then.
Hello.
I think everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes, sure. Thank you.
Just 1 second. I'm trying to figure out something as I think I will just, sorry, I will have to stop sharing actually and give me another minute because I think I'm having a little issue with the sharing screen option. Sorry for this. Okay. So I think you can now all see my screen again.
Yes, good, Elsa. Thank you.
Great. So I will start. So I hope it's moving. I'm not sure actually if it is moving. Yes. So just to give you a little overview, what is IOM? IOM is basically the leading international organization for migration. It was established in 1951. It's the leading intergovernmental organization in the field of migration, and it is committed to the principle of humane and orderly migration and within societies. IOM is part of the UN system and as a related organization. IOM, of course, the mandate is to support migrants across the world, developing effective responses to the shifting dynamics of migration. You can see here that I'm representing the IOM Belgium and Luxembourg office today with my colleague Sophia, who's also present. At IOM Belgium country office, of course, IOM has offices all around the world. In this office, we mainly focus on assisted voluntary return and reintegration. We also do operation movement assistance, and we also focus on labor mobility and human development. And this is where the Ecocity Project was actually developed and implemented. In the LHD unit, we provide assistance to vulnerable migrants. We work on labor migration, labor market integration, labor mobility, complementary pathway, and also diaspora topics. I will go now to the next slide to explain it, to dig in a bit more into the actual Ecocity project. One of the observations that was made is that migrants who are at risk of or who survive sexual and gender-based violence are less likely to seek support because of the many barriers that they face to access frontline support services. What was noticed is that there's a lack of information on rights regarding sexual and gender-based violence. There's also a reticence to seek support, a sort of stigmatization from migrants suffering from sexual and gender-based violence. There's also linguistic and cultural barrier, fear of reprisals, transitory irregular nature of stay. There's also a lack of early identification and referral by frontline workers, and lack of accessible complaint and recovery mechanisms. All these were the initial needs identified for this project to be developed. So basically, these obstacles push migrants to not necessarily go and talk to frontline support services. And of course, this was the starting point of the project. I will now go to explain a bit what sexual and gender-based violence is. Sexual and gender-based violence refers to any act that is perpetrated against a person's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relationships. It's, of course, a human rights violation. It's violence directed against a person because of their gender. It is, of course, for both women and men. It's also linked to abuse of power. And it's also acts that inflicts physical, sexual, socioeconomic, emotional, psychological harm or suffering. And threats of such acts and other deprivations of liberty are also part of sexual and gender-based violence. These acts can actually occur in public or in the private realm. It's just important also to note, as you can see in my slide, that gender is not only about women, but of course, women are generally most impacted by gender inequality. I would also like to pinpoint that gender-based violence and violence against women are terms that are often used interchangeably, and it has been widely acknowledged that most gender-based violence is inflicted on women and girls by men. But of course, when we talk about gender, it's important to say that it's not only about women. So the analysis that there's a lot of sexual and gender-based violence that migrants experience through their journey was the starting point of the project. I will now go to explain, of course, that sexual and gender-based violence and migration are interlinked in the sense where gender affects migration, and migrants are exposed to sexual and gender-based violence all the way through their journey. So from departure, as you can see, to arrival. So when they depart, it can be a reason for them to migrate or move countries. They are also exposed to SGBV on the way. It's risks that they can be exposed to while they're transiting. Also, when they arrive in their country of arrival, they can also be exposed to such risks because they're quite vulnerable. It's also important to note that migrants can experience multiple discrimination, which we call which is basically the intersectionality approach, where migrants are exposed to multiple discrimination. So an intersection analysis considers a collection of factors that affect a social individual in combination rather than considering each factors alone. So basically, you can experience as a migrant multiple streams of discrimination because of your sexuality, your age, your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, your class, your culture. And when all these factors come together, it creates multiple discriminations or multiple vulnerabilities that you're exposed to. I will now explain now a bit more. This was just a little introduction to the concepts that were prevalent for the Ecocity project. Now, the objective of the project was to support local authorities in fostering inclusion and protection of migrants who are at risk or who have survived SGBV violence. The idea was indeed to build capacity of frontline workers in EU cities on SGBV and migration, and also to raise awareness on SGBV and migrants' rights. I would explain now a bit more how this is linked to integration, because I think it's also very important to make this link, as the more you build the capacity of your frontline services and frontline workers into dealing with migrants who are at risk or who have survived SGBV, the more you can integrate these people into your society and support them in their integration. Just to give a bit of a reminder, or maybe an explanation actually, that integration is actually a concept that entails that it's a two-way process of mutual adaptation between migrant and host societies, in which migrants are incorporated into the social, economic, cultural, and political life of receiving communities. As such, integration entails a set join of responsibilities from migrants and host communities. So this is just to explain that when we talk about integration, we talk about a two-way process of adaptation, a mutual understanding, a set of joint responsibility that needs to come from both the host communities and the migrant. And within this project, the host communities is actually the frontline workers and frontline services that were supported in building their capacities to integrate, to better protect, to better identify migrants who have been exposed to or who have survived sexual and gender-based violence. Indeed, let's say, the motto of the project was indeed to better identify, better protect, and better orient migrants who have been exposed to SGBV or who have survived SGBV. Just to give also a little more explanation, the integration also entails two related concepts, which is social inclusion and social cohesion. Social inclusion refers to migrants' inclusion and full economic, social, cultural, and political participation into the host community, whereas social cohesion refers more to concepts such as anti-discrimination, countering xenophobia, and promoting mutual understanding. Inclusion is more related to how do you ensure that a migrant or your target group is well integrated into society from a social perspective, an economic perspective, and also a civic and political perspective. Whereas social cohesion refers more to the broader, let's say, environment where you can try to prevent discrimination, xenophobia, and promote mutual understanding between host communities and migrants. So Ecocity was piloted initially in 4 partner cities, Brussels, Luxembourg, Rome, and Gothenburg, where each partner city focused basically on developing a specific toolkit through partner organizations. These organizations were Femmes en Détresse, the city of Gothenburg, Rainbow House, City of Rome, Sapienza, and Etna. The project was also funded by the European Union Rights, Equality, and Citizenship Program. I will now probably dig in a bit more into the actual core of the project. So as we said, the idea was to build the capacity of frontline workers. And so the initial focus, there are 2 beneficiaries for this project. So the frontline workers, but also the migrants. In this slide, we're going to discuss how frontline workers were approached and the initial assessments that was made towards their capacities into better identifying, better protecting. Sorry? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard there was just, I think it was a microphone that was open. So initially, a needs assessment was conducted through surveys, focus group, and interviews with each city, a partner city of the project, where we assess the needs of frontline worker to understand a bit more what they knew about this specific subject. What was noticed is that there's a lack of knowledge on SGBV, on migration, and on intercultural dialogue, and there's also a lack of tools. When we talk about frontline workers, we talk about health and social worker, law enforcement workers, staff in shelters, and all types of urban services, including, of course, the city services. The second beneficiary, of course, of the project are the migrants and people with a migrant background who were also targeted and assessed. So we noticed through an assessment and focus group that there were many barriers to services and complaint mechanism for survivors on SGBV. So as I said in the very beginning, migrants are sometimes hesitant to go and express what they've gone through or talk to frontline workers because of the stigma around SGBV, and also because complaint mechanisms are not necessarily in place in the different cities that they arrive. There was also an assessment that there's a specific need of the LGBTIQ plus migrant community that was not sufficiently identified and answered, and also that the spaces where migrants and people with a migrant background go to are not usually safe. And I will get back to this concept a bit later because it's one of the toolkit that was developed. I just want to maybe go back one slide to explain that, again, the idea of the project was to have better knowledge and increased capacity to provide services to SGBV survivors from frontline workers with the aim of helping migrants and people with a migrant background to have increased access to these frontline services. Just to give a bit of an overview about the actual project and the stakeholders, as you can see in this graph, IOM was coordinating the entire project. The idea was to work with, of course, 8 project partners and cities, so four partner cities and 4 partner organizations that supported each other in coming up with tools. There was also an expert, so 4 toolboxes were developed. These toolboxes were reviewed by a panel of experts in the topic, approximately 30, I think it was, yes, 34 experts in total that have very diverse professional backgrounds. Adding to this, the project organized different thematic committees, thematic workshops, gathering almost 66 training cities and organizations that are around the table to have an open and interactive discussions with Ecocity partner on the development of the toolkit. And I think this is where LCA was actually part of these trainee cities. I was not part of the project because I'm not the project manager. Unfortunately, she's on maternity leave, so I'm just replacing her today. But I know that this is why you contacted us today, because you took part of these thematic workshops. Also, the end goal was to be able to reach approximately 250 plus cities through dissemination by the trainees, by the 63 training cities and organization, by the project partner, but also through other dissemination tools within the EU and elsewhere. I would also like to say that, and I will explain this, that all the toolbox, this entire process that was put in place was to ensure indeed that the toolbox that are developed are well reviewed and feedback or gathers from people in the field, from frontline workers, but also from experts to ensure that these tools are relevant to the purpose of the project, but also to the for further dissemination. I will now explain a bit more what are these 4 practical toolbox, and I think this is where you can see that it will be very practical for you as representatives of local council. So the aim of the Ecocity project was to develop 4 toolbox, and the results were these 4 toolbox that you can see on the slide. The first one is the safer spaces for LGBTIQ plus people with a migrant background. It's aimed at setting up safer frontline services. The second toolbox that was developed was parenting in a new country. It's how to engage in trust-building dialogue with migrant parents. The third toolbox is SGBV against migrant women and girls, aimed at providing tailored services as a frontline worker for migrant women and girls who have been exposed or at risk of SGBV. And the last one is, of course, working with unaccompanied migrant children and how to provide tailored services as a frontline worker to this target group. It's just important to note that these toolboxes are of high quality. They're easily downloadable and online and accessible in different languages. They are very practical and adaptable to different local contexts, and they were developed based on the needs and the inputs of the local authorities, trainee cities, as I just explained, thematic experts, as also I explained, frontline workers as well, who are piloting these trainings, and of course the end group, which are SGBV survivors and migrants themselves through surveys and focus groups. Each tool was developed by the project and has carefully been put together by a team and reviewed by different loops of feedback. I will now maybe start explaining the first toolbox that was developed, which is the setting up a safer space for LGBTIQ plus people from a migrant community. This toolbox was developed by in the Brussels capital region, so in Brussels, with Rainbow House Brussels. The aim is to create and manage safer spaces for people with a migrant background who identify as LGBTIQ+. Just to clarify, LGBTIQ+ means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer. It's inclusive of individual with diverse sexual orientation, gender identities, gender expressions, and or sex characteristic who use other terms or no terms to describe themselves. This toolbox has been developed to bridge a gap between the LGBTIQ+ community, people with a migrant background, and frontline services in urban contexts. The Rainbow House is, of course, the LGBTIQ+ Federation in Brussels, who speaks, of course, who gathers all the association that work with this target group. So the different sections of this toolbox have been developed for all frontline workers, especially those who have little or not a lot of resources at hand. The toolbox was developed to be both informative and practical, opting to use an accessible language and simple exercises to everyone, regardless of the level of education. So actually, I will explain at the end, it's very easily downloadable, and you will see that it's an entire package that was developed that can easily be taken and replicated within your local context. So it's actually very practical and very easy to use. The toolbox does not aim, of course, to achieve the impossible task of giving a foolproof recipe of how to act when meeting someone who combines a specific set of intersectional identities. But of course, it's just to equip frontline workers into how to make their spaces more safe to accommodate the LGBTIQ plus migrant community. The toolbox is addressed to workers of existing urban services dealing with issues of sexual and gender-based violence, first responders within, like, for instance, the police, the fire departments, hospital staff, services, of course, providing psychological support, medical or social assistance, social cultural organization, intended as safe spaces for women, girls, and people with diverse genders and sexual characteristics. Yes, and the toolbox actually contains 5 different sections. It has an introduction. It includes also different guidelines. The guidelines are mainly addressed to staff of urban services with managerial power. It provides tips on how to make one's workplace more safe, on how to organize safer events and activities from the ground up. The focus of the document, of course, is set on what frontline workers can do to make their spaces more safe outside of the human interaction component. So it's how do you integrate in your structure the notion of safer spaces. The user manual, which is also included in this in the entire package, is addressed at any frontline worker of urban services to ensure the safety of everyday one-on-one interactions, as well as group activities and events. The training manual is also addressed as LGBTQ trainers who have experience on topics such as LGBTIQ plus issues, race, racism, and migration. Alternatively, this manual can also be used by people who may need additional information and are unable to be trained right away. So the goal of this training manual is to provide background knowledge to help frontline workers of urban services working on topics related to SGBV and or LGBTIQ plus inclusion to make their spaces as safe as possible to people who are both LGBTIQ plus and who are perceived being from the migrant community. There's also very powerful awareness raising materials that were developed that are aimed at frontline workers to emphasize the need to provide safe and accessible urban services to LGBTIQ plus people from a migrant background. So there are 3 videos available and a poster and flyers. And the videos are meant to be used by beneficiary cities in order to raise awareness about the need for safer spaces within their functioning. Just to give you maybe a bit more information and understanding about what a safe space is. A safe space basically is a space perceived by an individual as welcoming and accepting of their identity, in which they can share information about themselves without fear of negative repercussion. It's a climate that makes people feel truly respected and physically, psychologically, emotionally secure enough to take risks, express and explore their views, identities, attitudes, and behaviors. So this is the entire aim of the toolbox, is how do you ensure that you can create a space that would support, that is welcoming enough for people to be able to express what they've gone through, or and for them to be better integrated at the end into their new society. The more spaces are inclusive, the better it is for everyone, because then you make city services more accessible, and of course you enhance your integration capital. So the toolbox objectives were indeed to provide a better understanding of the need for safer spaces for LGBTIQ plus people with a migrant background. It's also to provide it's a learning about the basics of how to set up a safer space and how to manage them. So by, for instance, looking at our own biases, about deconstructing whatever we have been integrated before, to exchange about our own experiences, and also to learn how to prevent and react to microaggressions. I will now explain a bit more what the second toolbox is about. So as you can see, it's about parenting in a new country. The city of Gothenburg developed this toolbox to support frontline workers in communicating with migrant parents. So this toolbox is more dedicated to migrant parents and how they deal and how to create trust-based dialogue within the frontline services space. And the aim was indeed to develop and strengthen preventive and promotive approaches to work against violence in a family context. So it mainly focuses on on creating the trust-based dialogue space so that parents can talk about, for instance, their experience into parenthood, into migrating, into how to create their new identity, to be more culturally aware, how to build trust in society, what are the rights of children, what is the roles within the family, to also talk about domestic violence and how this can be prevented, and also honor-related violence and oppression. The central objective, of course, is to provide knowledge to parents about their rights, to receive support from frontline welfare services, especially their right to parental support. Trust-based dialogue is therefore, of course, the starting point. The toolbox helps frontline workers in providing the support parents are entitled to by also working with intercultural mediator. This toolbox, as you can see, contains 7 modules, each focusing on one specific topic. And there are also awareness-raising materials included as a set of images that can be used when communicating with parents. Frontline workers that can be targeted by this toolbox are, for instance, social workers, teachers, community guidance workers, and civil society actors that are in a position to support or to talk or to engage with newly arrived parents, children, and youth to ensure their well-being into their transition and development. Of course, the aim is also to strengthen the parental role of migrants, focusing specifically on these newly arrived migrants and promoting the well-being and livelihood of migrant children and their families, as well as contributing to the prevention of sexual and gender-based violence. Of course, the link with integration can be done by the fact that if you support parents into their transition into parenthood, of course, you allow for the entire family to be more included at the local level. I will now move to the third toolbox, which is SGBV against migrant women and girls. This was developed with the NGO Femmes en Détresse with the support of the city of Luxembourg. It's a toolbox that aims at providing more tailored support to migrant women and girls who survived sexual and gender-based violence. It focuses on women and girls, while the previous one that I just explained focuses more on the parents. So this one focuses really on migrant women and girls. The other one, the focus was more on how to support parents when dealing with SGBV. With SGBV. So the toolbox is directed at frontline professionals and practitioners working or wishing to work in the context of the reception and integration of migrant communities, in particular of women and girls, so that who provide, for instance, medical, psychosocial support, legal, administrative, and or general assistance to these communities. The toolbox is a comprehensive introductory tool on SGBV affecting migrant women and girls, with both theoretical and practical elements. It is adaptable and suitable in a professional setting, but also in a training context. The toolbox is composed, as you can see on the slide, of 4 modules affecting SGBV, of 4 modules, sorry, on SGBV affecting migrant women and girls, each including a set of both theory and practical aspects. So module number 1 is more of a general nature. It introduces the concept of SGBV in the context of migration. The second module focuses more on domestic violence. The third module on human trafficking, and the fourth module on how on other prevalent form of SGBV, such as female genital mutilation, forced marriages, honor-based violence, violence based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Each module has a set of has field support annexes with additional practical guidelines for professionals. You also have a section that provides a bit more a framework on the international EU and national framework that exists elsewhere, and also some definition and statistics on how to respond on these topics. The last toolbox that was developed within the Ecocity Project is working with unaccompanied migrant children. So the toolbox was developed by ETNA and Sapienza University in cooperation with the International Organization of Migration, with IOM. This toolbox has been developed to train professionals who work with unaccompanied migrant children in reception centers. It aims to familiarize frontline workers with the topic of SGBV violence and its impact on migrant children. The toolbox also includes a training manual to train UMCs on the topic of SGBV, which should help them in their transition to adulthood. All training tools in this toolbox contain mindfulness exercises that will help users reduce stress and better cope with also emotions. So this toolbox contains 4 training manuals and 1 supporting video with testimonies from UMCs. There's a training manual to train frontline workers working with UMCs. There's an additional training for intercultural mediators working with UMCs. There's also another training for legal and volunteer guardians of UMCs, and a training manual to train UMCs as well. Now, I think what you will probably find very interesting for you as local representatives is the fact that each toolbox contains a step-by-step guide. And I'm going to explain now what is the step-by-step guide. It's a practical section in each toolbox that explains how any city or any frontline working of any frontline services can actually deploy the toolboxes in their field and local context. So it's directed to cities, and it explains a bit, it basically provides a process on how to basically implement these toolbox and move forward with training frontline workers to the different topics that we've been that I have shared with you today. So the step-by-step guide, it's basically to how do you start from scratch if you want to implement these toolboxes in your cities. The first step is to assess your needs. So you have to assess the training needs within your local context. So you have to first list relevant organizations, assess gaps in knowledge, assess gaps in training, in assistance, and organize focus groups also with organizations to better understand where is the exact need in terms of training with regards to these topics. You also have to assess your capacities. So you will start with listing, for instance, the training tools that already exist within your city. You also have to check which trainers could be available from the list of organizations that you have first listed when you wanted to assess the needs, and and assess if there is anyone in these organizations that could be a trainer. Then you also have to map any other sources of funding that exists. Then you have to define the objectives of your city and organization. So what do you want from this toolbox? Which topics do you want to focus on based on the training needs that you've assessed and also your current capacities? When you defined your objectives, you have to put a time frame for the toolbox, a time frame for the actual implementation of the toolbox, and also a target of how many local councils, how many people, how many frontline workers you want to train at the end. You also have to plan your action, of course. So you have to meet with the trainers, meet with the experts. You have to adapt your training content to your local context. You have to send the invitation and organize the entire logistics. Then once you've basically deployed, used the toolbox and deployed the trainings that you've assessed that are needed, you have to evaluate your actions. So you have to create an evaluation form and see if the training that you provided to frontline workers was actually beneficial and had impact. And at the end, you have another section or another step, let's say, where you have to ensure the sustainability of your action. So you have, of course, to continuously adapt the content of your training. You have to maintain. I think someone has his microphone on. Yeah, thank you. You have to maintain the content up to date, and you also have to continue to use the tools in your localities by making sure that the content is adapted. So now just to close up on my presentation, I would like to just inform you that these 4 toolbox that I've shared with you today are downloadable in several languages on the Ecocity website, on the IOM webpage dedicated to the Ecocity project. If you go there, you can just have access to all the documents needed for you to deploy and use these trainings within your local context. So it's very straightforward. It's available in very different languages per toolbox. And of course, if you have any questions, we're always happy to reply and to provide more guidance. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, me and Sophia are of course ready to listen and reply.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
I will share the link in the chat, and so that it will be more easy for the participants to check out the project. Are there any questions or any feedback that you would like to give either to Elise or Sophia they are from IOM Brussels, okay? We have equivalent here of IOM in Malta, but this time we did admin for all with IOM Malta. We did a project, we participated in a project. However, this time around, DSA participated with IOM Brussels in this project.
Yeah, I think you were, Leanne, you participated in all the toolbox, right?
Yes,
thematic comedy workshops.
Yes, and we were in Brussels for the workshop as well.
Yes.
We will share the link with you, okay, so that you can do any questions. We can even share, Elisa, your email address. Maybe they can
sure.
you directly, because obviously here there are many local councillors from different local councils and different regional councils, which all have their own characteristics and challenges within the locality. So they also partner up with you maybe to start implementing this project within the region or within their locality. Thank you, Elsa.
Thank you very much. I can also share in the chat now the link actually to the webpage so that you can directly see. I can do this, Leanne, no problem.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Now we have Mariosa Caruana from the JRS. Right,
Hi, Eva.
We can switch in Maltese for the benefit of the participants. I think we can all follow him in Maltese as well, so that we can mix up a bit of both languages. Mariosa, fidejk.
All right. So can I have a presentation bil-Malti u xek?
Kif tixtieq inti tagħmel?
All right. Slides are in English, so everyone can still follow as well. So I'll share the screen 1 second. Kulħadd qed jara l-screen, please, just to confirm.
Hemm tagħmilha slideshow eżattek tajjeb.
Tajjeb. So,
thank you.
Perfect. Mela, jiena mill-JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, ovvjament kif jgħid l-isem, aħna naħdmu ħafna mar-refuġjati, u aħna nħobbu ngħidu mhux ngħinu refuġjati ma naħdmu magħhom u we serve refugees, għaliex biex nkunu nafu dak li jkun x'għandu bżonn, all right, we need to know them quite well, għax kultant jista' nassumu dak li jkun il-bżonnijiet ta' dak li jkun. Infatti aħna nippruvaw kemm jista' jkun naraw in-needs varji ta' nies għax kull persuna għandha hopes u dreams differenti u we try to accompany them f'dak il-journey. Dawn huma basically 3 valuri li aħna nimxu magħhom bħala NGO, so l-ewwel waħda diskutejt issa hija accompany, mbagħad għandna wkoll serve, nofru a number of services, għandna pereżempju teachers, għandna nurses, lawyers, għandna psychosocial team fi għandna counselors, għandna social worker, għandna wkoll psychologists magħna, u mbagħad għandna l-basic integration services fi ħanidħol naqra iktar fuq u iktar quddiem għax naħseb huwa il-lok fejn nistgħu anke we collaborate issu flimkien bħala mal-local councils għax intom tintaqgħu ma' ħafna nies differenti fil-lokalitajiet tagħkom. U mbagħad għandna wkoll il-valur ieħor li we advocate, f'liema sens. mhux biss at a policy level u at a legal level, iżda wkoll nagħmlu proġetti fil-komunitajiet kellna wieħed milux fejn ħdimna ma' local councils u anka ma' parishes, knejjes, fej intqajna fi gruppi tal-parroċċa u tal-komunità u għamilna sessions fuq refuġjati, fuq immigranti, kif ukoll ittakilljajna ftit ċertu xenofobja u indifference anka through encounter, ġifri kellna asylum seeker, kellna refuġjat magħna fej they share their story u kien hemm lok għal mistoqsijiet ukoll. Issa xtaqt nibda xi ħaġa vera bażika għaliex tgħiduli ma nafuhom dawn l-affarijiet, ma jimpurtax, imma nemmen ukoll huwa importanti nifhmu il-vera basic terminology hawnhekk. Mela, l-ewwel nett kieku jkollna nitkellmu min hu migrant, alright, l-ewwel nett qasem definizzjoni li isa waħda vera uffiċjali ta' min hu migrant. Iżda jekk ikollna narawhom kollha u naraw common basis u bejniethom, migrant huwa xi ħadd li jitlaq mill-pajjiż A u mar f'pajjiż B. Ħafna drabi jkun hemm l-għażla li jitilqu biex imorru f'pajjiż ieħor, jekk anke taqbżilhom f'dak il-pajjiż u xed taħdem għalihom f'dak il-pajjiż jistgħu jmorru lura fil-pajjiż oriġinali tagħhom. So jisu hemm żewġ għażliet. Normalment naraw ħafna worker migrants, naraw students, jew xi ħadd li jirtira u jmur pajjiż ieħor bħala retirement f'pajjiż ieħor, dak ħafna drabi huma migrants. Refugee u asylum seeker huma kemm xejn differenti u nixtieq nidħol ftit fuqhom. Aħna naħdmu ħafna ma' asylum seekers u refugees, ma naħdmux ma' the general isa overarching term ta' migrants. Aħna naħdmu ma' refugees u refugees huma nies li normalment aħna ngħidu iva nies li telqu minħabba l-gwerra. Iżda mhux biss. Dik hija parti vera żgħira mid-definizzjoni ta' min hu refuġjat. Refuġjat huwa xi ħadd li jekk jibqa' fil-pajjiż tiegħu jiġi persekutat, issa forsi il-kelma ngħidu ma x'inhi eżatti li tkun persekutat. Hija basically il-hostility li jkun hemm lejn il-persuna jista' jkun jeħlu l-ħabs, jiġu torturati u beaten jew anke ġieli they face death penalties pereżempju. Minħabba mhux għax forsi huma kriminali, laqqas xejn minħabba race differenti, razza differenti, forsi change in religion, anka wkoll forsi jkunu gay, jew ma jaqblux mal-gvern li jkun hemm dak iż-żmien qed jiggverna. So dawn huma affarijiet li refuġjat ikollu jaħrab mill-pajjiż tiegħu iktar milli għażla, m'hemmx daqshekk choice għax qed tiġi forced li inti titlaq mill-pajjiż tiegħek għax jekk hemmhekk ħadd tiġi persekutat, ma jkunx safe. So jippruvaw morru in a safer country. So mhux biss ħabba l-gwerra dik hija waħda mir-raġuni ma hemm raġunijiet oħrajn. Kif ukoll normalment meta persuna they're fleeing their country malli jaslu f'country li huwa safe, ma ngħidulhomx mill-ewwel, ma nsejħux il-persuna mill-ewwel refuġjat, imma ngħidu li huma asylum seekers, persuni qed ifittxu l-ażil. X'jiġifieri? U dawn ma terminoloġiji x'kultant jintużaw naqra kollha l-istess, bekk importanti nifhmu d-differenza. Xi ħadd qed ifittex l-ażil normalment jekk ħanġib eżempju fuq mela jiena għal xi raġuni Malta mhix safe, ħajkolli bżonn nitlaq fl-ewwel pajjiż safe u mort ma nafx l-Italja, alright għax forsi l-iktar viċin. Hemmhekk jiena ma ġejx mill-ewwel refuġjata, le, jiena rrid nitfa' application, u għas nitfa' l-application bid-dettalji tiegħi eċetera, eċetera, jiena niġi asylum seeker, I'm seeking safety, I'm seeking asylum. Mbagħad ikun hemm a number of interviews mal-persuna, sometimes it take months, unfortunately bħalissa sometimes it also take years, 3 to 4 years, sakemm il-persuna wara a number of interviews jiċċekkjaw jekk jgħidu iva li sod il-persuna vera jekk tindbat lura fil-pajjiż tagħha pereżempju mhuwiex safe. U jingħataw status, hemm status differenti ta' refuġjat. Fil-frit waffquni jekk xi ħaġa mhix ċara ta' tiddejqu xejn. Issa xtaqt ukoll min huma refuġjati li hawn magħna f'Malta. Last year dawn huma l-aħħar statistics li ħarġu last year, l-iktar li refugees li waslu by boat, dawn huma statistics ta' refugees li waslu by boat. Għax ikollna wkoll anke asylum seekers li jaslu mhux bil-fors bid-dajs anke bl-ajruplan. Kif qed naraw hemm is-Sirja, bħalissa s-Sirja hemm gwerra li għadha għaddejja. Xi ħaġa li nixtieqkom ukoll tirriflettu ftit fuqha hija l-idea li forsi fuq Instagram u social media tagħkom naħseb dawn l-aħħar ftit xhur ħabba s-sitwazzjoni li hemm Ukraine u bejn Russia u Ukraine, forsi telgħatilkom ħafna information u stejjer x'qed jiġri f'Ukraine, iżda ħafna drabi ma tantx tilgħu affarijiet fuq is-Sirja li fil-verità mhuwiex daqshekk post il-bot minn Malta u li hemm gwerra wkoll għaddejja bħalissa. Kif konna naraw pereżempju s-Sudan u l-Eritrea li huma jisom the boat second il-kemm l-iktar li ġew nies mis-Sudan u l-Eritrea f'Malta bħala asylum seekers, fis-Sudan naraw li bħalissa hemm ħafna violent tensions u conflict fil-reġjuni differenti. L-Eritrea, apparti li hemm ħafna abbużi ta' drittijiet umani fuq spektrum vera vast, waħda minnhom u l-iktar għaliex ħafna drabi jispiċċaw dej f'leader country hija li min ta' żgħira il-boys ġrijan girls jindbagħtu għal military service, mhux għal sena jew sentejn ma very lenti military service bil-fors, ikun forced. Nisimgħu ħafna imma Malta rġiel biss naraw u mela l-irġiel biss forsi mhumiex safe fil-pajjiż tagħhom. Reality is li vera Malta a good number of asylum seekers that arrive by boat are men. Ammont vera żgħir huma nisa u hemm ammont mhux ħażin li huma tfal. Importanti li nirrealizzaw ftit li n-nisa huma l-iktar vulnerabbli fil-vjaġġ meta jibdew il-vjaġġ tagħhom mill-pajjiż tagħhom. Ħafna drabi l-irġiel huma iktar stronger physically, forsi more stronger, u ħafna drabi n-nisa u tfal jew imutu fil-vjaġġ jew unfortunately n-nisa they are human trafficked, jinbijaw for sex trafficking, etc. Ħafna iktar forsi mit-tfal u mill-irġiel. So hija raġuni li għaliex ma jaslux in-nisa fil-vjaġġ landing destination tagħhom. Jekk tinnotaw ftit sew ukoll bħala tfal il-maġġoranza li waslu last year huma unaccompanied children. Xiġifieri bdew waslu mingħajr ebda tip ta' guard, jiġifieri la ġenituri, la xi ħadd adult li jieħu ħsiebhom. Il-maġġoranza 71 li mhuwiex ammont żgħir daw kollhom 13, 14, 15 immaġinaw il-vjaġġ li għamluh weħidhom jew li waslu mbagħad unfortunately weħidhom. Dawn huma importanti qed norihomkom biex nifhmu ftit min huma refuġjati fis-soċjetà tagħna. Xi ħaġa li nixtieq ukoll niddiskutu forsi ftit, nisimgħu ħafna kemm minn politikanti, kemm minn fuq in-news bejnietna, u intom bħala taħdmu fil-local council tintaqgħu ma' ħafna nies xi kultant nistgħu forsi ma nibqgħux nużaw din it-terminoloġija, immigrant illegali. Tajdu li ma mhux illegali ġi bla dokument ġi, ma ġiex kif suppost, ma ġiex in the legal means. Fil-verità, illegal describes an action, it does not describe a human being. So forsi tajdu li all right, qed nilagħbu blok bil-kliem mela mhumiex illegali huma, ma kif ġew illegali. Fil-verità huwa laqqas ma ġew b'mod illegali, għaliex hawn dawn id-drittijiet umani li kollha kemm aħna li qegħdin anke hawnhekk illum f'dan il-meeting għandna dawn id-drittijiet umani just for simply being a human being. Il-14th, jekk taraw sew, daw hemm basic right ta' education, li ma jkollokx discrimination, etc. The 14th one huwa the right to seek asylum. Jiġifieri alla ħares qatt Malta ma tibqax safe u aħna jkollna bżonn naħarbu minn hawn, anke jekk right now virnal u l-laptop u nitilqu, għandna dritt li aħna immorru f'pajjiż li huwa safe għalina u li nitolbu għal-azil f'dak il-pajjiż. L-iktar, the correct term huwa jew irregular migrant, forsi migrant li ma ġiex b'mod regolari, jew nkella asylum seeker. Qed ngħidi għax anke aħna, especially intom qed intaqgħu ma' ħafna nies, forsi nistgħu nkunu f'pożizzjoni li dak li jkun ngħidulu isma' ma ngħidux immigrant illegali, jew anke aħna stess u intom stess tibdew tużaw it-terminoloġiji sewwa. Issa, dan il-meeting ukoll nixtiequ niddiskutu ftit kif nistgħu jisu collaborate mal-local council u hawnhekk fejn jagħtilkom ħanitkellmu ftit fuq basic integration services. Dawn huma services li aħna noffru lill-klijenti tagħna lill-asylum seekers u refuġjati. U ħanaqsamhom magħkom għaliex intom jekk tintaqgħu ma' residenzi jew refugees u asylum seekers fil-lokalitajiet tagħkom, tistgħu tajdu all right għalhekk qed tistaqsini għal din jew għal oħra jien nista' nirreferi għal GRS u stanka l-qudiem ngħidilkom eżattament kif. So l-ewwel waħda hija bus card service, xi ħaġa li vera sempliċi, xi ħaġa li vera bżonn juża tal-linja card. Tajdu li tal-linja card mhux kemm tagħmilha online illum il-ġurnata, għal ħafna forsi ġiet iktar komda bil-COVID online, imma unfortunately klijenti tagħna mhux kollha jkollhom il-bank account huwa diffiċli biex ikollok bank account fi għandna iktar proċess twil u anke dak ngħinuhom f'dak il-qasam. Allura ma sax tagħmel baskar jekk inti m'għandekx online account. So dija xi ħaġa vera sempliċi u vera bżonn juża li aħna forsi noħduha for granted imma hija challenging ħafna għar-refuġjati u għall-persuni li tfittxu l-ażil. Nofru wkoll kemm CV writing, kemm ukoll ifittxu xogħlijiet u anke nippreparaw ngħinuhom jekk kun hemm bżonn biex jagħmlu job interview. Nitkellmu wkoll nofru servizzi ta' employment guidance for employment u anke jekk forsi tafu xi ħadd li jixtieq. Ġieli jkollna pereżempju isma' jiena għandi refuġjat jaħdem miegħi kif inhu l-aħjar mod biex ikun qed jaħdem miegħi b'mod kif suppost. Daw aħna nofru daw is-servizzi wkoll. Nofru wkoll għajnuna kif nagħmlu social security number, taxpayer number, apparti l-informazzjoni tal-ażil kif spjegajtilkom biex xi ħadd jitfa' proċess tal-ażil huwa ftit ikkomplikat. So aħna nofru dak l-għajnuna kif dak li jkun nistgħu nofru l-informazzjoni tal-proċess tal-ażil. Apparti minn hekk, nofru wkoll English classes u anke education classes, mhux essaċ aħna, imma aħna nistgħu nirreferu għal qaqdiet jew servizzi li nkunu nafu qed joffru daw is-servizzi nistgħu nirreferuhom għalihom. Daw ma ftit mill-affarijiet li nagħmlu xemm ħafna iktar, jiġifieri pereżempju bil-COVID ovvjament se nofru iktar informazzjoni meta u minn fejn jistgħu jieħdu l-vaċċin pereżempju. So daw ma ftit affarijiet. Xtaqt nasemhom magħkom għax importanti biex jekk tipo we are at your disposal jekk ikollkom bżonn xi għajnuna fuq xi refuġjati jew immigranti jkun qed jgħix fil-lokalità tagħkom tgħidu nisma' anke tistgħu ċempluna tgħidu nisma' ntqajna pereżempju ma' dil persuna refuġjata anke forsi iktar ċara minnu refuġjat li ma jaqgħux taħt l-immigranti kollha, refugees and asylum seekers, aħna nistgħu ovvjament nigwidawkom bl-aħjar mod ukoll anke għalikom. Xi ħaġa importanti wkoll, dan in-number tistgħu tniżluh x'imkien jekk tridu. Jiena kont bagħat anke lil a couple of weeks ago qisu dokument fejn kien hemm naqra tal-informazzjoni iktar miġbur. U hemm dan in-number ukoll, dan huwa WhatsApp number. Importanti li mhux iċemplulna jew jibgħatu a text message, it's a WhatsApp number. Skużawni. Dan il-WhatsApp number jistgħu nirċievu messaġġi b'lingwi differenti, ġifieri jekk xi ħadd forsi l-Ingliż ma jafx jikteb bl-Ingliż, jista' jibgħatilna bl-Arbi jew b'lingwi oħrajn għax aħna għandna translators jaħdmu magħna allura nkunu nistgħu naqrawhom u anke nibgħatu lura b'dik il-lingwa, ġifieri mhux problema jekk il-lingwa tkun an issue. Dan in-number ħeġġeġkom tieħduh naqa' nota ħalli anke jekk jiġu xi refugees jew asylum seekers forsi fl-office tagħkom u tistgħu titgwidaw tgħidulhom naf min jista' forsi jgħinkom dak il-qasam u tadduru dak in-number. Importanti li by appointment, especially issa bil-COVID iktar u iktar qed nidu affarijiet importanti jkunu by appointment mhux jiġi kulħadd b'sal u anke dak in-number li huwa WhatsApp number. Jiġifieri importanti li jibgħatu on WhatsApp. Basically, dak minna ħatijaj, xaħġa oħra zaħira, dan ukoll huwa l-email address tagħna u l-office number tagħna, biex jekk ankintom jekk għandkom xi informazzjoni forsi tgħidulna tixtiequ staqsu iktar tixtiequ intqajtu ma' xi ħadd li tixtiequ tgħidulna kif l-aħjar li ngħinu, these are the information li tridu tikkuttantjawna fuqhom. Xi ħaġa li nixtieq nagħlaq biha hija li following anke kienet il-presentation ta' qabel, meta tagħmlu hemm proġetti li huma interessanti ħafna u naf li ħafna minnkom tibgħu tagħmlu inclusive projects fil-komunitajiet, xi kultant naraw naqra qisu assessment needs, ġifieri naraw ftit imma nies differenti fil-lokalitajiet x'inhuma n-needs tagħhom u x'inhuma l-idejat tagħhom. Għax xi kultant naħdmu fuq proġett u mbagħad indaħlu n-nies wara fuq on that project. Ideally, forsi vera jkun naqra iktar ħin u aktar resources, imma li nieħdu qisu l-needs li hemm qabel, naraw dak li jkun hemm nies differenti fil-komunità u naħdmu l-proġett mbagħad skont dawk in-needs. U idealment li jkun hemm monitoring biex taraw dawk in-needs għadhom relevanti. Ma x'anke aħna mix-xogħol tagħna tant jinbidlu l-affarijiet, meta tkun qed taħdem man-nies kif I'm sure li anke intom tesperjenzaw fix-xogħol tagħkom, tant meta naħdmu man-nies tant jinbidlu l-affarijiet. Li xi ħaġa importanti that we keep on also monitoring dak li nkunu qegħdin nagħmlu. Ta' kollox minn naħa tiegħi, nixtieq ningrazzjakom tal-li smajtuni u fil-fri staqsuni any questions li tixtiequ.
Sorjoza, ma nafx hawn xi mistoqsijiet.
Jekk jogħġbok.
Mela,
Yes,
Stephen
sure,
mill-Kunsil ta' Ħalbalzan.
Yes, Stephen Gatt minn Ħalbalzan.
Hi, Stephen.
Le, għandna familja, għandhom problema li dawn ilhom Malta 17-18 sena. Il-frattemp twildulhom iż-żewġ subien. Wieħed għandu 17 illum il-ġurnata u l-ieħor għandu 15-16. Issa qegħdin jibżaw li daw speċjalment da ta' 17 sena oħra jaqlaq 18. U għat m'għandux li huwa recognized daw għax twildu Malta. Qed isir xi ħaġa fuq għadi.
Mela, li ħansaqsik huma refuġjati, għandhom stat ta' refuġjat?
Jien naħseb Bażilium.
Il-lami u ilhom daqshekk. Orrejt, mela ħanajdlek x'l-aħjar nagħmlu. Ma nafxux problema għalik. L-email tibgħat ilna jew issaqsi lilhom ħanibdew hekk hemm two options. Jew issaqsi lilhom jekk inti għandek kuntatt magħhom, ittihom dak il-WhatsApp number jibatulna, jiġifieri literalment jgħidulna isma' għandna qed nibżgħu. Kif għadek ispjegajt li inti, qed nibżgħu aħna li t-tifel tagħna issa ħajla 18, eċetera, eċetera, tistgħu tgħidulna naqra sitwazzjoni kif qiegħda u x'nistgħu nagħmlu, għax dak jidħlu anke l-avukati fiha, ikunu iktar jafu l-proċedura eżattament u jistgħu jigwidawhom aħjar. Ma nafx jekk tagħmilx sens għalik, ma nafx għandek
Iva, jiena attwalment President tal-Past Pupils tal-kulleġġ sana jiġifieri nafkom inside out. Imma jom kella nġibhom hemm għandkom.
Issa peress li ħabba l-COVID bħalissa li tal-appointment jana qara ixu, għalhekk qed ngħidlek ara two options jew dik li għadlek li jibatu huma. U nigwidaw magħhom. Jew nkella ċempil ninti f'isimhom jekk tajjeb għalik dejjem ovvjament tistaqsi lilhom. U tgħidin nisma' nista' nagħmel appointment għalihom hemm two options. Aħna normalment insaqsu lilhom biex inti żgur jekk taħidu huma ħajjibatu.
Għax xejn infarkin l-omm u l-missier.
Żgur, żgur. Ġifieri ara x'l-aħjar, jiena l-opinjoni tiegħi li tgħaddilhom dak in-number u jibgħatu huma ħalli inti ħallejt f'idejhom jekk iridux aħna ngħinuhom jew le. Imma that's another option jekk tixtieq inti.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ansi.
Thanks, Stephen. Xi ħadd ieħor jixtieq issaqsi jew jirmarka.
All right, good afternoon and very well done for both presentations. Dal-aħħar, sorry, għal-karozza.
Kemm tfakkarna daqsxejn milli ma kunsill, jiena naf.
Slima jekk Skużani, għad fil-karozza ma kelli wassal it-tifla low levels. Dal-aħħar kelli opportunità li ngħin xi ħadd mill-Etjopja. U nexxieli anke sibtu job. U għandu l-ID card Maltija, ħarġitlu ftilu, issa tal-buħ, is-Social Security Number. Dak għamil ċoplas biss, jew tistgħu tgħinuh anke intkom biex imur iġibu.
Mela.
Għaddi kien sejjer il-ġimgħa d-dieħla.
Mela, ovvjament il-ġoplas hija l-entity tipo li definitely jekk ħajmur hemmhekk għandhom ikunu tajnuna. Imma l-istess bħalma ngħid il-Steve.
Isibu lest, jrid japplika għalih.
Skużani, mhux ma fimtekx, merġajdli.
Dak diment li ħarġet l-ID card tiegħu hemm diġà Social Security Number jew irid japplika għalih.
Mela, ħankun onesta miegħek, employment mhix l-erja tiegħi assolutament, u ma rridx nikkummenta u ngħaddi xi ħaġa żbaljata, ħankun onesta miegħek. Imma għandna xi ħadd li aħna jaħdem specifically fuq employment. Jiġifieri din il-persuna tkun tista' ittik l-informazzjoni korretta definitely. So, aħna ġa ngħidlek bħal Stephen, inti dak tkellmu dil-persuna, għandek kontatt magħha. Ħanajdlek, għaddilhom dak in-number tal-WhatsApp u jikteb għajdu jikteb tipo li għandu bżonn il-security number, eċetera, eċetera, jekk nistgħu nigwidaw.
Jien għandi l-kopja tal-ID cards tiegħu. Nista' nagħmilha jiena għax kultant bil-lingwa dejjem niftehmu.
Ħanajdlek, jiena ħankun kif dejjem ngħidu. Isek biex idealment titlob il-permess tiegħu. U bekk aħna ngħidu tajt lilu ħalli uħa jgħid isma' jien iva nixtieq l-għajnuna mill-JRS u jagħmilha hu. Imma mbagħad jekk intom you're in good communication fi sens tintaqgħu tistgħu anke tkun ħdejja u tkellmu tajlu titnamluha flimkien pereżempju. Ma nafx hekk kontx ċara.
Iva, fimtek u anke ħabba data protection jew dal-affarijiet.
Għalhekk. Aħna dejjem nippruvaw ngħidu lilhom biex ovvjament fi sens WhatsApp ħafna drabi kull iktar li jintuża x'hekk m'għandekx kredit b'xi mod issib wifi x'imkien u tinqeda.
Għandu kredit. Alright, miss. Grazzi ta'
Skużani ma stajtx inwiġbek fuq, amma
ma jimpurtax. Imma kombinazzjoni kien sejr il-ġob tas il-ġimgħa d-dieħla. Da ngħidlu jiktbilkom, forsi tirrisponduh f'xi moment mbagħad.
Ekku, jekk ma wiġbux mill-ewwel, ma jiġix imwieġeb mill-ewwel għax nirċievu ħafna WhatsApp messages, imma nippruvaw kemm jista' jkun malaj.
Alright. U Etjopjan. U hemm il-gwerra pajjiżu. Ġifieri bekk ħarġitu l-ID card. Għandu 3 snin, ħarġitu l-ID card għal 3 snin u Malta.
Temporary għal 3 snin, all right. Grazzi ħafna, ta' napprezza.
Grazzi, thank you.
Biex mistoqsijiet oħra, jew xi ħadd jikkummenta. Aħna minnaħa tagħna, Marjoza, ħankunu qegħdin nifforwardjaw dawk iż-żewġ dokumenti li kont battilna aħna konna għaddejjhom ir-reġuni bil-flyers u l-informazzjoni. U jekk tkun tista' tixxerja magħna il-PowerPoint presentation nkunu nistgħu ngħaddu wkoll il-parteċipanti.
Definitely. I will do just after this session nibatu lilek li jen il-PowerPoint tajjeb.
Yes, please.
Thank you ħafna lilkom.
Grazzi ħafna, vera interessanti.
Thank you.
Thank you tal-ħin ta'kom.